It started with a letter, a plain white envelope with the HOA's logo in the corner, dropped in my mailbox like a summons. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, homeowners associations love to send letters. Warnings about trash cans left out too long, reminders about landscaping guidelines, even petty notices about the shade of blinds in your windows. But this one wasn't just nitpicking. This one was something far worse. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, were bold words that made my stomach tighten. The portion of lawn extending past your front walkway has been reviewed and determined to be HOA property. You are not permitted to landscape, decorate, or use it as personal space. I read it 3 times, blinking, as if the words might change. That little strip of grass, the one I mowed every weekend, edged carefully, even reseeded after the brutal summer. They were saying it wasn't mine? I pulled out my deed, maps, everything. The property line was clear. The yard was mine. It had always been mine. And yet, here it was in writing. The HOA claiming a piece of my property as their own. Most people would assume it was a clerical error, maybe even a misunderstanding. But I knew better. I'd been in this neighborhood long enough to know how the HOA operated, especially under the thumb of its president, a woman named Margaret, who treated the entire subdivision like her personal kingdom. Margaret was the kind of person who always had a clipboard in her hand, who peered through hedges and took photos of people's cars if they parked a little too close to the curb. She'd once fined a neighbor for having holiday lights up on December 26th. She'd even complained about kids leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk, saying it was visual pollution. So when I saw that letter, I knew this wasn't an accident. Margaret had decided to make a move, and that move was against me. First, I considered fighting it directly. Hire a lawyer, challenge the claim, drag out the paperwork until they gave up. But I also knew how messy that could get. Legal battles with HOAs weren't just expensive, they were exhausting. They thrived on wearing you down with bureaucracy, letter after letter, notice after notice, until you either gave in or drained your savings. No, I decided. I wouldn't fight them on their terms. I'd fight them on mine. The thing about HOAs is they love control. They thrive on the ability to tell you what you can and cannot do. But sometimes, if you find the right loophole, you can turn their own rules against them. That's when an idea began to form. Something bold, something so ridiculous that it would be impossible to ignore. If they wanted to claim my yard wasn't mine, then fine. I would turn it into something no one in the neighborhood could resist. That's when the mini golf plan was born. It started small. A few wooden planks, some artificial turf I picked up on clearance, and a cheap windmill obstacle I found online. I laid them out one Saturday morning while neighbors watched from their windows, pretending not to be curious. The first hole took shape quickly, and by the afternoon, I had people slowing down as they drove by, staring at what I was building. By the end of the weekend, I had 3 holes, a simple putting course, right there in the middle of the yard the HOA had tried to claim. Kids walking home from school were the first to try it out, their laughter carrying down the street. Parents came too, hesitant at first, but soon smiling as they lined up putts. Within a week, the little strip of grass that had been taken from me had become the most popular spot in the neighborhood. People came from blocks away just to see it, to play, to hang out. For once, the street felt alive. And of course, Margaret hated it. I saw her car sit, low down one evening as she passed, her face tight with disapproval. She didn't stop, didn't roll down her window, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. What she didn't realize was that I had anticipated her reaction. HOAs love their rule books, but nowhere in ours did it say you couldn't build a recreational feature on your own property. And since I'd checked the property lines 3 times over, I knew I was in the clear. The yard was mine, the course was mine, and as far as the rules went, I was untouchable. At least, that's what I thought in the beginning. Because when Margaret finally made her move, she didn't come with letters or fines. She came with something far more dangerous: a campaign. A whisper network of complaints, carefully spread through the neighborhood, designed to turn everyone against me. At first, I didn't notice. The mini golf course was thriving, and people seemed happy. But slowly, little changes began to creep in. Neighbors who once waved stopped making eye contact. Kids who used to play after school suddenly weren't allowed. I overheard murmurs about property values and distractions. It became clear that Margaret had begun planting seeds of discontent, framing my mini golf course not as a fun addition to the neighborhood, but as a nuisance, a liability, even a danger. The war for my yard had just begun. And as I looked out at the glowing lights of the windmill hole one evening, I realized something important. If Margaret thought I was going to fold under pressure, she was in for a surprise. Because this wasn't just about a strip of grass anymore. It was about standing up to the petty tyranny of the HOA. What started as a battle over property lines was about to become something much bigger. And Margaret had no idea just how far I was willing to go. The whispers spread like ivy, slow at first, creeping quietly along fences and hedges, then suddenly overtaking everything. What began as harmless chatter about my mini golf course turned into a neighborhood-wide narrative carefully crafted by Margaret, the HOA president who had decided to make me her latest target. It started with a rumor. I overheard two neighbors in hushed conversation by the mailbox one evening. They weren't talking directly to me, but the words carried, "I heard the HOA is going to fine him. They say the course attracts strangers from outside the neighborhood." I brushed it off at first. After all, most of the people playing were families who lived just a few houses away. But Margaret knew how to spin a story, and soon the rumor grew. She claimed the mini golf course was causing congestion on the street, that cars were parking dangerously, that noise levels were out of control. None of it was true, but truth was never the point. Perception was. Within weeks, I started receiving letters again. This time, they weren't about property lines. They accused me of violating noise ordinances, creating safety hazards, and even commercializing residential property. Each letter carried a thinly veiled threat: fines, mandatory removal, and if I didn't comply, legal action. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if it weren't so exhausting. I wasn't charging anyone to play. The course was free, built purely for fun and community. And yet, Margaret's narrative painted me as some kind of rogue business owner, exploiting the neighborhood for profit. The strangest part was how quickly people began to believe it. Some neighbors who had once cheered the course now avoided it. Parents pulled their kids away, muttering excuses about being busy. Invitations to block parties stopped coming. Margaret had managed to turn something joyful into something divisive. But for every neighbor who bought into her story, there were still a handful who stood by me. They played openly, defying the stares of others. They offered quiet words of encouragement, reminding me I wasn't alone. And their support lit a fire in me. I realized that if Margaret wanted at a war, I couldn't just defend myself. I had to fight back. So I doubled down on the mini golf. I added new holes, each one bigger and more creative than the last. A winding ramp that spiraled around a bird bath. A tunnel that looped under a small wooden bridge. Even a hole with a tiny castle at the end, complete with drawbridge. The kids loved it. The parents admired it. And for every new obstacle I built, Margaret's fury grew. Her next move was almost laughable. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, one that everyone was encouraged to attend. Flyers were taped to doors, emails blasted out, and before long, the entire neighborhood knew the purpose of the meeting: to discuss the unauthorized recreational structure at Lot 14. My lot. My home. I went, of course. Not to argue, there was no point debating Margaret in her own arena, but to watch, to see how far she would go. The meeting was packed, folding chairs lined in rows inside the community center. Margaret stood at the front, clipboard in hand, radiating smug authority. She spoke at length about the threats posed by the mini golf course, potential injuries, property value concerns, liability issues. She painted pictures of lawsuits waiting to happen, of outsiders flooding in, of chaos eroding the peace of the neighborhood. People nodded. Some even clapped. Others shifted uneasily, clearly caught between enjoying the course and fearing Margaret's wrath. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I reminded them that the yard was my property, legally documented. I explained that the course was safe, free, and built with care. I mentioned the joy it brought to children, the way it brought neighbors together. And then I stopped. I didn't beg for approval. I didn't argue every point. I simply laid out the truth and left it there. The room was silent for a moment. Margaret tried to push again, waving papers and citing vague bylaws, but I could tell her grip was slipping. Not everyone was convinced by her campaign. Some still remembered the laughter of their kids, the fun of putting a ball through the little windmill, the sense of community it had created. The meeting ended without resolution. Margaret promised further review, which everyone knew was code for more harassment. But as people left, I caught glimpses of something important. Doubt. The spell she had cast wasn't as strong as she wanted it to be. Back home, I sat on my porch, watching the glow of the mini golf lights. I knew the battle was far from over. Margaret would escalate. She always did. She couldn't stand losing control, and my course was a symbol of defiance she couldn't tolerate. Sure enough, the escalation came within days. This time, it wasn't letters or rumors. It was a notice posted directly on my door, bold and official. The HOA was filing a complaint with the county, claiming I was in violation of zoning ordinances. They were trying to drag the fight beyond the neighborhood into government offices where the stakes were higher. For a moment, I felt the weight of it pressing down. County officials meant bureaucracy, hearings, paperwork that could stretch on for months. Margaret was determined to bury me in red tape until I surrendered. But she had underestimated something crucial. I had more than just determination. I had evidence, documentation, and a growing number of allies who were tired of her reign. And if she wanted to take this fight beyond the neighborhood, then so be it. I was ready. Because what Margaret didn't realize was that the mini golf course wasn't just a course anymore. It was a battleground. And I was prepared to defend it at all costs. The HOA had struck back. Now it was my turn to strike harder. The county notice sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded weapon. Black print on white paper stamped with an official seal, declaring that a formal complaint had been filed against me. The accusation, zoning violations, unauthorized construction, and use of residential property for recreational purposes without proper approval. In other words, Margaret had managed to pull the fight out of the neighborhood and into the county's hands. It was a clever move in its own petty way. The HOA could write endless letters, but those only carried weight within the neighborhood. By filing an external complaint, Margaret was trying to drag me into a fight I couldn't ignore. She knew most people would crumble under the pressure of government hearings, legal jargon, and the looming threat of fines or forced removal. But she'd miscalculated one thing. I wasn't most people. The next morning, I gathered everything I needed: my deed, property survey maps, HOA bylaws, and photos documenting every stage of the mini golf build. I wanted a complete record ready for anyone who dared to question me. The course wasn't commercial. It wasn't unsafe. It wasn't against zoning laws. It was a backyard project, nothing more. And I was prepared to prove it. A week later, I found myself in a bland county office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I sat across from an official reviewing Margaret's complaint. She wasn't there, of course. People like her rarely were. Instead, she had submitted everything in writing, dressing up her grievances in legal language designed to make me look like a menace. The official read through the stack of papers, then glanced at my evidence. He asked a few questions, nodded slowly, and finally leaned back in his chair. His verdict was clear. There was no violation. The course was harmless, and the county had bigger problems than chasing down a few pieces of artificial turf and wooden planks in someone's yard. Relief washed over me. The complaint was dismissed. Margaret had lost, but victory was fleeting. When the news reached her, she didn't retreat. She doubled down. That evening, another letter arrived. This one not from the county, but directly from the HOA board. It announced a special vote to be held at the next meeting, a proposed amendment to the community bylaws. If passed, it would ban unapproved recreational installations on residential properties, retroactively applying to existing ones. In other words, the HOA was rewriting the rules to target me. It was a desperate move, but also a dangerous one. If the amendment passed, they could legally demand I dismantle the course. I realized then that this wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about power. Margaret needed to prove she could control every aspect of the neighborhood, that no one could defy her authority and win. If she succeeded, it would embolden her to go even further. If she failed, her grip on the HOA would weaken. The vote became the talk of the neighborhood. Some people saw it for what it was, an overreach, a personal vendetta disguised as policy. Others, swayed by Margaret's scare tactics, worried about liability and property values. The lines were drawn, and the neighborhood was split in two. In the days leading up to the meeting, I noticed small signs of rebellion. A neighbor across the street set up a slip and slide for his kids, clearly daring the HOA to object. Another family built a small tree swing in their front yard. It was as if my mini golf course had inspired others to push back, to reclaim their properties from the suffocating grip of HOA rules. But Margaret wasn't blind to this shift. She intensified her campaign, sending out flyers filled with exaggerated warnings about lawsuits and insurance risks. She even claimed that my course had already caused an injury, though when pressed, she couldn't name who or how. By the night of the vote, the tension was palpable. The community center was packed again, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs. Margaret stood at the front, her voice sharp and commanding as she presented the amendment. She saw the poke of protecting the neighborhood, of maintaining order, of ensuring fairness. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't rant. Instead, I spoke plainly, reminding everyone why the course had been built in the first place. Not for profit, not to cause trouble, but to create something fun, something that brought people together. I pointed out the absurdity of rewriting rules just to target one neighbor, and I asked them to consider what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in, one where creativity was encouraged, or one where every blade of grass was policed by fear. When I finished, silence hung in the air. Then came the vote. Hands went up, one after another. 4 against, 4 against. The tally seesawed back and forth, each count raising the tension. When the final hand lowered, the results were clear. The amendment had failed by a narrow margin. I had won again. The room buzzed with murmurs, some relieved, others frustrated. Margaret's face was tight with fury, but she masked it quickly, pretending the outcome didn't matter. But I saw it in her eyes, the realization that her control was slipping. Back home, I thought the worst was behind me. The county had dismissed her complaint. The HOA had rejected her amendment. My mini golf course stood stronger than ever. But Margaret wasn't finished. People like her never stopped when they lost. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back harder. And as I sat on my porch that night, listening to the faint clink of a golf ball rolling into the windmill hole, I had a gnawing feeling in my gut. The battle had escalated. The next round wouldn't just be about rules or votes. Margaret would take things further. And when she did, the entire neighborhood would feel the fallout. The defeat at the community vote should have been the end. Margaret had thrown everything she had at me, county complaints, rule rewrites, smear campaigns, and still, she had lost. Any reason, able person would have accepted the outcome, maybe even stepped back and reconsidered their approach. But Margaret wasn't reasonable. The morning after the vote, I woke to find my yard littered with garbage. Fast food wrappers, crushed soda cans, even a half-empty paint bucket tossed right onto the artificial turf. The course I had spent weeks building, the course that had brought laughter and life to the block, was now smeared with sticky soda and splattered paint. At first I thought it might be random vandalism, but then I noticed the placement. Each hole had been deliberately targeted. The windmill blades bent backward. The little castle toppled over. The bridge split in half. It wasn't random. It was sabotage. I cleaned it up, angry but undeterred. Neighbors noticed what had happened, and whispers began again. Some offered quiet sympathy, others shook their heads, but no one dared say Margaret's name aloud. Everyone knew who was behind it, but no one wanted to be the one to accuse her. For a while, things seemed calm again. But the calm was only surface level, like still water hiding dangerous currents underneath. Margaret had shifted tactics. Instead of direct attacks, she began applying pressure through her loyalists on the HOA board. Suddenly, inspections of my property became a regular occurrence. Notices about my lawn length, about my recycling bins being an inch too far from the curb, about a cracked paver stone on my driveway. Each one came with the threat of fines. It was death by 1,000 cuts. None of the violations were serious, but together they created a constant stream of harassment, a steady drip designed to wear me down. It was Margaret's way of saying, "I haven't forgotten, I won't forgive." But I refused to let her break me. Instead, I focused on reinforcing the very thing she hated, the mini golf course. With the help of a few supportive neighbors, I rebuilt the vandalized holes, stronger and better than before. We repaired the bridge, repainted the castle, and straightened the windmill. And then, just to spite her, I added lights, bright LED strings that made the course glow at night, visible from half a block away. The effect was immediate. Families came back. Kids laughed again. The glow of the lights turned the course into a beacon, a symbol of resistance against the pettiness of HOA control. Margaret could fine me all she wanted, but as long as the course stood, she hadn't truly won. That's when the cracks in the neighborhood began to widen. On one side, there were the loyalists, neighbors who clung to Margaret's narrative, convinced the course was an eyesore and a danger. They muttered about lawsuits and declining property values, parroting Margaret's words as if they were gospel. On the other side, there were those who had grown tired of the HOA's constant meddling. The families who enjoyed the course, who liked the freedom of adding a swing set or a small garden gnome without fearing retribution. They saw Margaret's crusade for what it was, a personal vendetta disguised as neighborhood order. Lines were drawn, sometimes literally. One neighbor refused to speak to another after a heated argument about the HOA. Groups formed, whispers spread, and soon the neighborhood wasn't just divided, it was at war with itself. And at the center of it all was the mini golf course. Margaret, sensing her grip slipping, escalated again. This time she hired a private security company to patrol the neighborhood, citing safety concerns. Men in reflective vests began driving slowly through the streets, stopping near my house more often than anywhere else. Their presence was meant to intimidate, to remind me that Margaret still had power. But it backfired. The patrol cars made people uneasy. Neighbors began complaining, questioning why their HOA dues were being spent on security woe. And there hadn't been a single crime in months. Some whispered that Margaret had gone too far, that she was abusing her position. Then came the breaking point. One evening, as kids played on the course under the glow of the LED lights, the security patrol stopped in front of my house. 2 men got out, approaching the course with flashlights. They told the kids to leave, claiming it was unsafe to play after dark. Parents, startled, rushed to gather their children. The scene was tense, quiet, except for the protests of confused kids. I stood on my porch, watching, fury boiling inside me. Margaret had crossed a line. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was interfering with the joy of families, frightening children to prove a point. Word spread quickly. By the next day, the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. Even those who had supported Margaret began questioning her judgment. Kids weren't a liability, they were the heart of the community, and Margaret had targeted them. The fallout was swift. An emergency petition began circulating, calling for a vote of no confidence in the HOA board. Neighbors whispered about removing Margaret as president, about reclaiming the HOA from her iron grip. What had once seemed unthinkable was suddenly possible. As I watched the petition gain signatures, I realized something important. This fight had started with me, with a simple strip of grass and a ridiculous idea to turn it into a mini golf course. But it had grown into something bigger. The neighborhood wasn't just battling over my yard anymore. It was battling over its soul. And the final showdown was coming. Margaret wouldn't give up without a fight. She would dig in, cling to power, and try every trick in the book to keep control. But the tide was turning, and for the first time she wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting the entire neighborhood. The fallout had begun, and the endgame was on the horizon. The petition spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. What had started as whispers at mailboxes and hushed conversations on sidewalks grew into a movement that couldn't be ignored. Neighbors who once kept their heads down were now openly signing their names, declaring that they had had enough of Margaret's reign. By the end of the week, the required number of signatures had been reached. An emergency meeting was called, not by Margaret, but by the residents themselves. It was unprecedented. An HOA meeting forced by the people, demanding a vote on whether Margaret should remain president. The days leading up to the meeting felt like the build-up to a storm. On one side were Margaret's loyalists, clinging to her promises of order and protection of property values. On the other side stood those who had grown tired of living under constant surveillance, fines, and fear. I was at the center, not because I sought leadership, but because the mini golf course had become the symbol of everything Margaret opposed. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed tighter than ever before. Tension hummed in the air. Margaret sat at the front table, clipboard in hand, her posture stiff, her smile thin. She looked calm, but her eyes betrayed her, darting, sharp, calculating. The residents took their seats, and the floor opened. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke. Some defended Margaret, praising her for keeping the neighborhood in line, for protecting investments. But far more voices rose against her. They spoke of the endless fines, the petty letters, the vandalism no one dared to confront, the intimidation tactics, the children told to leave the mini golf course by hired guards. Every story piled onto the last, the weight of evidence too heavy to ignore. When my turn came, I didn't deliver a fiery speech. I simply reminded them all of how this began. With a strip of grass the HOA tried to claim wasn't mine, how, instead of backing down, I built something that brought joy to the neighborhood. How Margaret, instead of embracing it, chose to crush it. This isn't about mini golf, I said, steady and firm. It's about control. It's about whether we live in a community or under a dictatorship. The room was silent. Even Margaret didn't interrupt. Then the vote began. One by one, hands raised. Some shook nervously, others went up with confidence. For Margaret. Against Margaret. The count grew, and the room's energy shifted with each tally. It became clear, long before the final count, that Margaret was losing. When the numbers were announced, it was decisive. Margaret was removed as HOA president. A new board would be elected in her place. The room erupted. Some clapped, Some cheered, others simply sighed in relief. Margaret sat frozen, her face pale, her grip on her clipboard so tight her knuckles whitened. For the first time, she had no words, no authority to hide behind, no power left to wield. And then, in a move that would become neighborhood legend, she stood abruptly, gathered her things, and stormed out without a word. The slam of the community center doors echoed like the final note of a song. The battle was over. But the war left scars. The neighborhood was still divided, trust between neighbors frayed by months of conflict. Some people avoided me, unable to let go of the narrative Margaret had planted. Others treated me like a hero, thanking me for standing up, for showing them that resistance was possible. Back at home, I walked through the mini golf course that night, the lights glowing softly against the dark. For the first time in months, it felt peaceful. There were no guards patrolling, no angry flyers, no threats taped to my door. Just the quiet click of a ball rolling into the windmill, the faint laughter of kids allowed to play freely again. But I knew Margaret wasn't truly gone. People like her didn't disappear quietly. She had been dethroned, humiliated, stripped of her title, but she still lived in the neighborhood. And I knew she would find ways to remind us of her presence. For now, though, the course stood tall. A victory not just for me, but for everyone who believed in living without fear of constant oversight. It wasn't just a mini golf course anymore. It was a monument to defiance, to standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. The showdown had ended in my favor. But the story wasn't quite finished. Because while Margaret's power had crumbled, her bitterness had only just begun. And soon, she would try one last desperate move to drag me down with her. For a while, it seemed like peace had returned. With Margaret dethroned, the HOA moved cautiously under interim leadership. The board focused on repairing fences, both literal and figurative, mending the cracks that months of conflict had left behind. Notices became rare. Fines slowed to a trickle. Neighbors who once avoided each other began exchanging small nods, tentative smiles, and in some cases, apologies. The mini golf course thrived. Families came regularly, laughing and cheering as they tried the trickier holes. It became more than just entertainment. It was a meeting place, a landmark that gave the neighborhood a sense of identity. For the first time in a long time, the community actually felt like a community again. But Margaret wasn't gone. She had lost her title, but not her spite. At first, she kept her distance. She avoided neighborhood gatherings, drove past my house without slowing, and didn't answer when people knocked on her door. Some thought she had finally given up, that the humiliation of her downfall had silenced her. They underestimated her. It started with a small claim she filed in civil court. She accused me of lowering her property value, citing the mini golf course as a nuisance that made the neighborhood look like a carnival. The claim was flimsy, built on opinion rather than evidence, but it forced me to respond. Then came the anonymous complaints to city services, noise violations, trash violations, even a claim that I was operating an unlicensed amusement park. Each time officials came out, looked around, and left shaking their heads. There was nothing to enforce, nothing illegal, nothing wrong. But that was Margaret's plan. Not to win, but to drain me. To bury me under paperwork, inspections, and stress until I cracked. I didn't. Because every time she pushed, the community pushed back. Neighbors signed letters of support, offering statements that the course was safe, fun, and welcome. Parents spoke about the joy it brought their kids. Even the interim HOA board issued a formal note declaring that the course was not in violation of any bylaws. Margaret had become isolated. Her old loyalists stopped defending her. The more she lashed out, the more she looked like what she truly was, a bitter woman clinging to power she no longer had. And then, in her last desperate move, she made a mistake. One night, I returned home to find the mini golf course vandalized again, but this time, it was worse. Holes slashed through the turf, obstacles smashed with blunt force, lights ripped down and scattered across the lawn. Whoever did it had been vicious, deliberate. But unlike before, this time there was proof. A neighbor across the street, tired of Margaret's antics, had set up a security camera after his own property had been mysteriously egged weeks prior. That night, the camera caught everything. Margaret herself, under cover of darkness, sneaking into my yard with tools in hand, tearing through the course like a storm of fury. The footage spread quickly. First to me, then to the interim HOA board, and, soon, to every resident in the neighborhood. There was no denying it. No spinning the narrative, no blaming outsiders. Margaret had been caught red-handed, destroying not just my property, but the symbol of everything the neighborhood had fought to protect. The fallout was immediate. The HOA formally censured her, banning her from holding any future position of authority. Neighbors who once tolerated her cut ties completely. Some even demanded legal action, furious that their children's beloved course had been targeted. I had the option to press charges. Vandalism, trespassing, destruction of property, it was all on the table. But after everything, I made a different choice. I repaired the course, stronger and brighter than before, and I let the footage speak for itself. Margaret's reputation was ruined. She had destroyed herself far more effectively than any lawsuit could have. In the weeks that followed, the course became a rallying point once again. Neighbors came together to help rebuild, bringing paint, lumber, even new decorations. Kids designed their own obstacles, parents pitched in to install them, and soon the course was bigger than it had ever been. It was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone. As for Margaret, she retreated into silence. Her house, once a hub of HOA authority, grew quiet. The clipboard was gone, the constant surveillance ended. She became a ghost on the block, a cautionary tale of what happens when control turns into obsession. Looking back, I realized the fight had never truly been about property lines, or mini-golf, or bylaws. It had been about power, about one person's need to dominate, and a community's decision to finally say no. And in the end, the victory wasn't just mine. It was everyone's. Today, when I walk out to the yard, I see kids laughing, parents chatting, neighbors mingling, people enjoying the kind of connection that HOAs claim to protect but often destroy. The wind spins, the lights glow, and the sound of a golf ball rolling across turf reminds me of how far we came. Margaret tried to take my yard. Instead, she gave me, and the whole neighborhood, something far greater. A reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply living freely, joyfully, and unapologetically, no matter how hard someone tries to stop you. The HOA saga was over, and the mini golf course stood as proof that we had won